Good evening, everybody from Australia. Good morning to those of you who are joining us from South Africa, Zambia, Cyprus, and the Netherlands, and to all of those of you who are joining us online, wherever you may be, to the Symposium, George Bizos and his Odyssey to Freedom, during which our panel of eminent speakers will reflect on the life and work of Mr. George Bizos, who sadly died on the 9th of September this year, aged, I believe, 93. And I'd like to take this opportunity from all of us to pass on our condolences to George Bizos's family. George Bizos was, of course, a leading South African human rights lawyer who had a long association with Nelson Mandela and was part of the team which defended Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, and others in the Rivonia trial of 1963-1964. My name is Jenny Webb. I'm speaking to you from Melbourne, where it's 7 o'clock in the evening. Our 4 speakers and 5 panel members come from 5 different countries and at least 4 different time zones. So it will be something of a miracle if we do manage to get everybody here at the appropriate time. We haven't quite got everybody yet, but hopefully we will soon. And a tribute to the organisation behind this event, which I'll speak about further in a moment. I had the pleasure of meeting George Bizos in Melbourne in March 2010, when I was invited to chair an event at which he was speaking. And it was one of those serendipitous occasions where almost everything went wrong. And in the end, everything turned out to be incredibly special. Alexis, who I'm not sure is with us at the moment, Alexis Bizos, I believe was there on that occasion, traveling with his father in Australia, he may remember. What happened is that we had a once-in-a-century extreme weather event in Melbourne, and Elizabeth Street, which is the lowest street in the CBD of Melbourne, became a river torrent, which is not surprising because before white settlement, it had actually been a riverbed, and on these occasions it turns back into a river. Nick Xenophon, the Senator for South Australia, who was to co-host the event, was unable to get here. We had water coming in through the ceiling at the back of the small theatre where the event was being held. But George Bizos, fortunately, was able to get there. He sat in the middle of this small performance space and spoke to us with great humility and passion and generosity about his life and his work. And then he answered questions from a rather damp and bedraggled crowd, those people who had literally been able almost to swim their way to the event. He was literally the calm in the middle of the storm. And for those of us who had managed to get there, it was an unforgettable evening. So it's a real pleasure to be able to chair another event in honour of George Bizos. George Bizos was also a founding patron of Agora Dialogue, and it's Agora Dialogue which is hosting this symposium. And I'd just like to say a few words about Agora Dialogue for those of you who are not familiar with it. Agora Dialogue was founded in Australia by Mr. Dinos Toumazos. It's a not-for-profit, non-partisan, independent organisation which since 2016 has been operating in Europe and in particular in Cyprus. Agora Dialogue is motivated by the obvious, simple observation that the practical wisdom which humanity has achieved over the centuries has important lessons for all of us, and it runs a series of programs designed to reinvigorate thinking around the big issues of justice, democracy, equality, living an ethically sound life, in the hope that such thinking, together with small group discussion and cross-sector dialogue, can and will lead to the development of a more attentive, more sustainable and more just society. So before I go any further, I'd like to thank Dinos Toumazos and Eva Ieridou, who I think is joining us from Serbia, for organising this event this evening. And I will thank them again, of course, at the end. I also just wanted to say that this evening just happens to be the evening when the most important sporting event in Australia is being held. That is our Australian football grand final. It should have been held in September and it should be held in Melbourne, which is the home of Australian rules football. But for the first time since 1948, it's being held in Brisbane in Queensland because we have in Melbourne been in stage 4 lockdown for something like 110 days. That is more than anywhere else in the world. So it couldn't be held here. Now I mention that because I suspect every Australian, apart from those of us who are online at this symposium this evening, will be watching it either on television or online from around the world as well as across Australia. And I don't have that much confidence in our not as good as it perhaps could be national broadband system that I may not, I may well lose the connection and not be able to get on. If that happens, we have a backup plan. Kyriakides has kindly agreed to step in if that. I hope it won't happen because I very much want to hear what our contributors have to say tonight, but just in case. The order of events, I will briefly introduce our 4 speakers and they will each speak for about 15 minutes and we'll then move to our panel discussion. So if I could introduce our first speaker, Mr. Georgiou, who's joining us from Perth. George is a lawyer who has been in practice for 34 years. He's a graduate of the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg and practiced law as an attorney in Alberton, South Africa, for 10 years before migrating to Perth, Western Australia in 1993. He was admitted as a legal practitioner in Western Australia in 1994 and has practiced since then in the field of civil litigation, mainly acting for catastrophically injured plaintiffs. He is the Western Australian chapter chair and member of the National Committee of the Hellenic Australian Lawyers Association, and he's very active in local Greek community affairs. George will speak to us about George Bizos's early life and tell us the remarkable story of how a small boy from a small town, a small village, I should say, near Kalamata in the Peloponnese in Greece, became a South African. Thank you, George.
Thank you. Thank you. In April 1941, the Germans invaded Greece and on 27 April triumphantly marched into Athens. This was after the Italians had in previous months failed in their attempt to invade Greece and were expelled by an ill-equipped Greek army on the Albanian border. This was the first victory of the Allies in World War II. Churchill gratefully announced in the House of Commons, "Hence we will not say that Greeks fight like heroes, but that heroes fight like Greeks." The Germans were, of course, a different challenge. Thousands of Allied troops, including Australians and New Zealanders, were rushed to the northern border of Greece to help repel the invasion. The defense failed dismally, and many of the Allied troops fled to the Kalamata region of the southern Peloponnese, mainland Greece's southern shore. The idea was to escape capture by the Germans and hopefully find a way to the island of Crete, which was under British control. The Germans took the southern Peloponnese by the end of April, and they captured 7,000 Allied troops. A shepherd from the small village of Vasilitsi, near Kalamata, thought that he noticed Allied soldiers hiding in the bushes near the spring where he took his animals for water. Fear of ruthless German reprisals for not reporting the presence of Allied troops, and even worse, harboring them, was real. The shepherd confided in the trusted 37-year-old former mayor of the village, who told him not to say a word to anyone else. Some of the villagers were distrusted as potential German sympathizers. He would make contact with the soldiers and offer them help. The village elder took his 13-year-old son with him to meet them. He took food because they'd be hungry. He took the boy with him because he'd gained their trust. After all, someone with a sinister motive would not bring a boy with him. 7 soldiers emerged from the bushes. They gratefully ate the food. They were dressed in shabby village clothes given to them by the Greek villagers along the way. They got rid of their uniforms to be less conspicuous. They walked by night to escape detection and hid during the day. They were given food by friendly villagers and had gone as far south as they could. Their spokesman was the most senior in rank, a sergeant named Lewis. He spoke a few ill-pronounced Greek words, which he learned in the short time that he had been in Greece. The father and son spoke no English. Gestures and common-sounding words did the trick. The villager gathered that the soldiers were New Zealanders, and their aim was to escape the German occupation by getting to the island of Crete. There they would rejoin the war. Crete was some 250 kilometers by sea, southwest of Kalamata. The sea could be treacherous. The villager promised to help them to get to Crete. He needed time to make arrangements. In the meantime, he had secretly sent them food, clothing, and cigarettes. Days after, the villager sent a note with the shepherd to the fugitives to assure them that progress was being made. An American was trapped in the village by the war. He had come to the village where he'd been born for a holiday. Significantly, he could write English. The villager dictated the note, which said, "We bought a sailboat. We will go together. It needs repair, and it'll be ready soon. Do not worry and don't be afraid. We will take care of you until we leave together. All expenses of food, boat, etc. is ours, because think is our duty and obligation. Good luck, sincerely yours." With the help of trusted villagers, the boat was prepared and stocked with supplies. The man was not a sailor, seasoned traveler, or an adventurer. He left his wife, parents, younger children, and the only life he'd known behind. His precocious eldest 13-year-old son, who accompanied his father to meet the soldiers, insisted on accompanying them. The father refused, but the boy threatened to swim behind the boat, and his stubbornness wore the father down, and he finally relented. And so, in the middle of May 1941, the boat was launched from a secluded bay near the village. It was 6 meters long, had one sail and 4 oars. The New Zealanders, the boy, and the father faced a hazardous journey to Crete. On the third day, after bad weather, choppy seas, and a broken sail, seasickness, and no idea where they were, a flotilla of naval ships was spotted on the horizon, sailing in a westerly direction. Were they British or Italian? They were desperate, out of options, and had no choice but to attract attention. A New Zealander had a pocket mirror, which he was able to reflect in the sun to catch the attention of one of the ships, which broke formation and dashed towards the stricken boat. As it approached, there was relief when the ship was identified as British, named the HMS Kimberley. The British ships were on their way to evacuate the Allied troops from Crete and transport them to Alexandria, Egypt. And so the New Zealanders and the 2 Greeks disembarked in Alexandria. The New Zealanders joined their units after an emotional farewell with the father and son. Lewis reported the bravery and help they'd received from the Greeks to his superiors. He was concerned that the father be compensated for the loss of his boat, which had been abandoned at sea, and the cost of provisions purchased. As a result of Lewis's report, the British command compensated the father in cash. Before they separated, the New Zealanders wrote down their names, regiments, and addresses on a piece of paper. The Greek asked for it because he hoped to make contact with the soldiers after the war. The father was sent to a refugee camp in Cairo. The boy was taken to an orphanage for boys in Alexandria. They couldn't return to Nazi-occupied Greece. Their aiding and abetting of the soldiers in their escape could come to the attention of the occupiers, who brutally treated Allied collaborators. Local Nazi supporters seeking favor with the occupiers could betray them. A few months later, the consul of Greece in Egypt offered the father the choice of free passage to India or South Africa. The father had heard of South Africa's abundance of gold and diamonds, which some said could literally be picked up off the streets. Other Greeks had gone there before the war and were successful. In August, the father and son boarded a ship in Port Suez. They were part of a group of 145 refugees fleeing war-torn Europe. The ship was also taking ill Allied soldiers stricken with TB contracted in Egypt to Durban, South Africa for convalescence. The father had what was left of the compensation and the note of the soldiers' details in his pocket. Fast forward 60 years. In 2004, George Bizos is awarded the prestigious Bernard Simon Memorial Award by the International Bar Association. This year, the award would be presented at the association's general meeting in Auckland, New Zealand. George was invited to receive the award in person. The venue of the presentation of the award was significant to George. He had a special and emotional connection with New Zealand. He often thought of the 7 New Zealanders and wondered about their fate. Had they survived the war? The note which his father was given with their details had been lost. They weren't able to contact them after the war. The only name George recalled, based on his boyhood recollection, was Lewis. At the time, George told the story of the escape and sea rescue in a BBC International interview. At the tail end of a discussion about his work as a human rights lawyer in South Africa and the award he was about to receive. It caught the interest of New Zealand's honorary consul in Belgium. George also told the New Zealand organizers of the International Bar Association's event about his interest in the fate of the soldiers. When George arrived in Auckland, his photo was on the front page of the main newspaper. The story of how the 75-year-old South African lawyer who had come to receive his award had some 60 years earlier been part of the escape of the 7 New Zealanders from Greece was headline news. George received a call from the journalist who wrote the article He was in his hotel room. The reporter excitedly proclaimed that the Lewis family had seen the newspaper articles and had contacted him. Unfortunately, Mr. Lewis had died 10 years earlier. However, his widow, daughter, and granddaughter wished to meet him. In an emotional meeting, Sergeant John Lewis's family recounted how he never stopped telling his family about the brave man, his son, and the generosity of the people from Vasilitsi and the soldiers escaped from Greece. The names of the other 6 soldiers were discovered. Only one of them, Sid Hay, did not survive the war. He was killed in action in November 1941. George was a relative of Mick Carrup, who also had repeatedly heard the story of the escape from their late uncle. Had George, during the war, received the cardigan lovingly knitted for him by Mick's mother and the money she'd sent him through the Red Cross? The journalist had come across copies of 2 documents which he gave to George. The one was the note which Alexis Bizos, George's father, had delivered to the hiding soldiers about the purchase of the boat, which I read earlier. The other was a letter sent by one of the soldiers, Staff Sergeant Gadding, to his parents in 1941. In it, he says, in recounting their escape, "We were discovered again. Again, extreme luck. This man took us to a better hiding place, and he proved a very fine man indeed. He and his family were poor, yet he risked hiding us for 6 days and fed us magnificently. We found the poorer the man, the more frequently they gave during this time. He was raising money to buy a boat. As I said, he was very poor. He and his family subscribed £28 and bought an old sailing boat. This had to be repaired and painted. Eventually, the Hun, fortunately not seeing the boat, the night of 18th May, we departed after kissing and embracing, which we genuinely reciprocated. They, referring to the people of Vasilitsi, were very fine charactered people, risking their all for us, and we owe them much indeed. That was our escape." In those 60 years in between, George faced unimaginable challenges, fear, heartache, and despair. But he never lost hope. Very few witnesses and contributors to the making of history. Very few are witnesses and contributors to the making of history. The story of how a 13-year-old village boy from Greece, who came to be intimately involved in the drafting and adoption of South Africa's democratic constitution after decades of racial injustice and oppression, is nothing short of miraculous. George did not return to Greece for over 30 years. The white government refused to issue him with a passport because he was perceived as a security risk. He, in the meantime, feared that if he went abroad, he may not be allowed to re-enter the country. During his absence, Greece had suffered a great deal. As a result of the war, over 300,000 Greeks died of starvation under Nazi occupation. Then followed the horrific civil war and political instability, which led to a military coup in 1967. So when George returned to Greece in 1972, both South Africa and his beloved Greece were under authoritarian regimes, which must have been a source of intense poignancy for him. But his dreams were finally realized. Imagine his joy when he traveled to Greece with his good friend Nelson Mandela, when both countries were free. During this visit, Mandela proudly and famously declared, "Greece is the mother of democracy and South Africa, her youngest daughter." Thank you.
Thank you, George. Hearing that remarkable story again, my heart goes out to George's mother, left behind in the village without her husband, without her eldest son, to get through the next 4 years of the war, and then after that, the civil war, in very difficult circumstances. That must have been terribly difficult, and presumably also with the threat hanging over the family of reprisals, which, as you say, were terrible. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Luli Callinicos, but I'm not sure whether she's with us, Dinos. Luli, are you there? I can't see you. Okay, in that case, we might go to our third speaker. I think the Honourable Dikagang Moseneke. Do we have? Yes. Are you okay to go next? You ready to go? We can't hear you. Can you turn your microphone on?
It's unmuted, thank you.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. If you're happy to go next, I'll introduce you, and then because we're missing our second speaker for the moment, so we'll go straight to you.
Very well, I'm ready, and I'll be privileged to proceed.
Okay. Okay. So our next speaker, the Honourable Dikagang Moseneke, is a South African judge and former Deputy Chief Justice of South Africa. He has had a very distinguished career as an advocate, a senior counsel and judge of the Constitutional Court, from which he retired in 2016. He was appointed Deputy Chief Justice of South Africa in 2005 and Acting Chief Justice in 2013. And he served as Deputy Chairperson of the Independent Electoral Commission, which conducted the first democratic elections in South Africa. Mr. Moseneke has 6 honorary doctorates and was appointed Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand in 2006. He was a friend of Nelson Mandela's and a prisoner for 10 years with Mandela on Robben Island. In 2018, he received the Order of Luli in gold, the South African government's highest national honour, for his exceptional contribution to the field of law and the administration of justice. Mr. Moseneke has written a best-selling memoir called My Own Liberator, published in 2016, and his second book, All Rise, a Judicial Memoir, an insider's view of how the judicial system operates in South Africa, has, I believe, just been published literally last month. Mr. Moseneke will speak about George Bizos' contribution to human rights as a lawyer in South Africa. It's a great honour to have you with us. Please take the floor.
Thank you so much. And again, I repeat what privilege it is to talk about Uncle George, about the legendary George Bizos. I'll be repeating some of the things I said at his funeral, because they remain true up to now. And I thought that, and that would indeed include our personal connection, our joint connection to Nelson Mandela, our beloved departed first president of the Republic of South Africa. And of course, I will talk about Uncle George's legendary role in a human rights struggle as a lawyer. All of that, all told, might take all of this tribute and time. So I've selected and written what I really would like to say. I again recall Alexis phoning me, George Bizos' son, and I say, and I repeat again, that the call was very much reminiscent of the call he, George Bizos, and I received from Gracia Machel, Mrs. Gracia Machel, Nelson Mandela's widow, on that fateful night of the 5th of December 2013. We both rushed to Tata, as I fondly called him, which is father, Mandela's home in Houghton, but we both were a little late. So George Bizos and I arrived when he had just passed on. And I said to Alexis that I would come to see Uncle George. And this was just about 2 days before he passed on. And unfortunately, a very tearful Alexis phoned saying that Baba had passed on. So there again, not with him this time, lost the opportunity to pay my final respect to somebody who has been so dear, so powerful, so important in our lives. He asked me to write the foreword to his 65 years of friendship. It is an absorbing book. It's a heartfelt account of the enduring friendship between Nelson Mandela and George Bizos, founded on mutual abhorrence of injustice and a reciprocal affection, respect, and fidelity to the rights and struggle of our people. The book narrates the riveting tale of how, in the 1950s, George Bizos and Nelson Mandela met at the University of Witwatersrand. They both pursued a postgraduate Bachelor's of Laws degree with a view to qualifying as practicing lawyers. And both were outsiders, excuse me, to, if not foes of, the apartheid ruling elite. George Bizos was a Greek immigrant, yet to be admitted to South African citizenship. Nelson Mandela was a denigrated citizen in his land of birth. So Mandela studies screeched to a halt because of racial profiling and his proclivity for robust political activism. In contrast, George Bizos qualified and joined the ranks of a practicing counsel. In that precast dichotomy, Nelson Mandela was to become the incessant political accused and trialist for charges related to the Defiance Campaign of 1952, followed by the treason trial of 1956 to 1961, later his own trial of 1962, and ultimately the Rivonia trial, in which he and members of the African National Congress High Command were sentenced to life imprisonment. On the other hand, George Bizos was to become the dedicated and trustworthy counsel through the multiple trials of Nelson Mandela, but more importantly, through his daunting decades of imprisonment. Over the 27 years of imprisonment on Robben Island, and later on Victor Verster prison, George Bizos visited Nelson Mandela and unfailingly provided support for his legal and familial needs. He also served as a trustworthy political envoy to Oliver Reginald Tambo and to other highly placed activists who then were exiled. After the release of Nelson Mandela, up to his ascendancy to the presidency of the Republic of South Africa, their tried and tested friendship flourished, albeit in a markedly different setting. Mandela's own tribute to the enduring bond between him and George Bizos appears in his affectionate foreword in Bizos' biography, Odyssey to Freedom. Their close companionship persisted for 23 years, from the freeing of Nelson Mandela from prison to the passing on of our beloved president on the 5th of December, 2013. For one thing, in my 10 years of imprisonment on Robben Island, which coincided with Tata Mandela's presence on there and George Bizos' frequent visits. However, George Bizos and I met only after my release, when I became an attorney and later a practicing advocate of the Supreme Court and member of the bar, which George Bizos already was. But then George Bizos' professional tenacity and kindness ran well beyond Nelson Mandela, his friend. Only a few examples on an occasion like this should suffice. We did a good few cases together. It was my privilege to be his junior counsel, he being my leader. Together, we successfully defended Dr. Fabian Ribeiro, facing charges of abetting terrorism. Together, we defended journalist Tami Nkunazi, a very young Ronnie Mamwepa, yet to become a renowned communicator and activist. May his soul rest in peace. Together with George Bizos, we defended ANC activists, often without success. We successfully appeared for Ingwa Pele Madingwana, the famed author of an anthology called Africa, My Beginning. He was charged for possessing his own banned publication. And the question was whether in law, the ban extended to you, the author, being in possession of your own production and composition. And needless to say, George Bizos had a lot of fun in arguing the matter. And we were able to persuade even the apartheid judge that is mindless, excuse me, to have anybody committed to jail for being in possession of material that he produced himself, even though the material is banned. Together with George Bizos, we defended Zwelakhe Sisulu, fearless and imitable editor of The New Nation. After his release, Nelson Mandela asked George Bizos, Paz Langa, and me, and defend his wife, Nomzamo Winifred Madikizela Mandela. And for 6 months, George Bizos, Uncle George, as I fondly called him, and I, were all bound up at the hip, defending Winifred Mandela. And sadly, later, we're on opposite sides. When I served as counsel for Winnie Mandela, and he, George, served as counsel for Nelson Mandela in a very tragic and painful divorce. When it was not at all fashionable, particularly for white South Africans, George Bizos chose the side of the powerless, the tormented, and the oppressed. He chose the side of the village of the Batlaping people near Zeerust, who were facing apartheid, forceful removal from their ancestral land. It was George Bizos who resisted the eviction of these people. He chose the side of Neil Agat, a doctor who was killed in custody. He chose the side of Amel Timol, again, an activist and doctor who was killed under mysterious and careless circumstances in police custody. He was there for the family of Steve Bantu Biko as they searched for circumstances of his death in police custody, and so too into the death of the Craddock Four, who had disappeared in police hands with no trace whatsoever. That was the size of the man, that was the breadth of his commitment, but that was also the worth of his excellence as a lawyer, and in particular as a human rights lawyer. At the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, of course, it was at the end of apartheid. He battled for several victims of our inhumane apartheid system. He helped them tell their story. As though he had not done enough, George Bizos was there for the families of the miners who had been killed in Marikana under our democratic arrangement. Comes the time to retire, to rest? No, not for Baba Bizos. He served as house counsel for the Legal Resources Center, which was an entity that litigated a variety of cases for members of a public who could not afford their own legal fees. What stamina, what resilience, what steadfastness, what dogged commitment to others, with whom he, George Bizos, had no racial or ethnic or other ephemeral external attributes. On the face of it, he had no connection to us, but indeed he had. He cared because they too were human. He deeply hated oppression. He hated inequality and unfairness until to his deathbed. In the time I became a judge of the High Court and later a justice of the Constitutional Court and finally a Deputy Chief Justice of the Republic of South Africa, Uncle George was there looking at me and cheering me along. Every time George Bizos Senior Counsel, the advocate appeared before me as counsel in the Constitutional Court, I suffered the awkwardness of a mentee called upon now to be judge over his seasoned don, to be judge over his master. I never could go past that. But there he was, appearing with great humility and calling me all sorts of amazing titles, like my Lord and your honor and so on. George Bizos continued to remind me in his note to me, like all others, that I was just as close to his friend Nelson Mandela. And of course, you know that in the end, Nelson Mandela appointed Uncle George Bizos and I as his joint executors. And he asked it in a difficult way. Dikagang, when I am away, when I am gone, will you and George Bizos look after me? And I asked, what do you mean, Tata? And he said, I mean just that. When I'm no more here, will you be there to look after me? I now have to finish off the estate of our departed president alone, because George Bizos has now himself departed. At his 80th birthday as a heir to school, which he founded and grew with such great passion, I remember us all together heartily singing at his birthday. And at my mother's 90th birthday, I looked around. He, Uncle Bizos, who himself was 90, was present at my mother's birthday. And you must sit and think. He loved people. He comes to a village where my mother lives to come and pay her tribute at her birthday. And finally, after him, I was proudly awarded the George Bizos Human Rights Award. And for now, I proudly say there are only two people who hold the George Bizos Human Rights Award. It's Uncle George himself and me. Our profession will sorely miss him. I hope we will draw and drink from that eternal fountain of high, high human values. His life will always remind us, and I use that to remind other young lawyers, indeed all our people in my second book, All Rise. I remind all our people that they deserve dignity, they deserve respect, they deserve social justice, and that absent these things that Uncle Bizos lived for, they, the people, I pray and hope they will know it, and they will not tolerate it, and all will rise. That's my tribute to Uncle Bizos, and I thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that tribute from the heart. I'm sure there will be some questions or discussion for you when we reach the second part of the symposium. I hope you will be able to stay with us for that. We do now, I think, have Dr. Callinicos. Can you unmute your microphone? It looks like you're on mute. Okay.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can. I'll just briefly introduce you. Welcome.
I apologize for the mix-up.
No problem. Okay, Dr. Luli Callinicos, like George Bizos, is a South African of Greek descent. She's one of South Africa's leading social historians and the author of some of her country's most significant social commentaries. Her published work includes The World That Made Mandela and a commissioned biography of Oliver Tambo called Oliver Tambo Beyond the Ngeli Mountains. Dr. Callinicos has served as chair of the National Heritage Council, founder and board member of the Workers' Library and Museum, a member of the Council of the South African Heritage Resources Agency and the Freedom Park Trust, as well as being a council member of the Robben Island Museum. Dr. Callinicos will talk to us about George Bizos and her experience as a fellow Hellene in South Africa. Thank you, Lou.
Thank you very much. And it's a wonderful opportunity to meet the speakers, especially the judge and also other Hellenes all over the world. It's interesting, of course, Georgiou will have talked about George's early life. I find it interesting that he was, like so many people today, was a boat refugee. That's how he arrived in Africa. Nowadays, of course, many are leaving Africa and trying to find a life in Europe. Then it was the other way around. George's father, as we know, was a socialist, and he had a grounding which was not all that similar to young Greeks who were born in South Africa, where the Greek community felt more vulnerable, didn't want to rock the boat, as it were. And of course, South Africa at that time was a segregated society, a colonial one, in fact. We're talking about the early 40s, and with a huge oppression in many ways, both politically and economically, in South Africa of black people. So when he arrived, he was also very naturally sociable. And as a non-South African from a fairly enlightened village, he was immediately struck by the racial divide and the mistreatment of black people. And when he went to university, because he worked hard, he was smart, passionately interested in ideas, he noticed that there were very few black students at Wits. And I think that influenced his choice of law. The laws, of course, were highly racist, racially discriminating. And he chose law, and at the University of the Witwatersrand, which is in Johannesburg, and he became active in student organization and active in the SRC. So he was always, from a child, wanting to make a difference, or wanting to be there, wanting to make his voice heard. And he participated in student life with ease. His inclusiveness of fellow students. He easily joined a basketball team, and that's where I met him. I was 11 years younger than him, and he had already graduated as a lawyer when I became a student at Wits. But I admired him so much. I knew his story, and he was one of the first in his generation to get a university degree. So, these were all pointers for me. He was also known for his academic achievements as one of the early professional Hellenes. And I think in terms of his involvement, both with the South African community on the left, I suppose you would call it in those days, because when he graduated, he seemed to be getting all these briefs for people who were being politically persecuted. But at the same time, he didn't forget his identity as a Hellene. And in fact, over time, those of us who were both Hellenes and actively involved in fighting against apartheid in South Africa began to think of ourselves in a dual identity as Afro-Hellenes. He, of course, as we have heard, the tremendous contribution he made to both defending politically persecuted people, but also helping to shape the legal work and shape and modify some of the legislation over time. There were many historic trials. One trial, however, affected me directly in that 4 university students and 1 university lecturer were arrested and put on trial for undermining or trying to overturn the system. And my husband was a lecturer in sociology at the time, and he was arrested and taken off to prison for a week. I immediately phoned George to let him know, and he negotiated a release of the political prisoners while they were arranging for the trial. The trial took a whole year, and amazingly, and I think it had to do with the legal team, Arthur Chaskelson, of course, George Bizos, Dennis Cooney and others, they were finally acquitted. And the magistrate had said that they had been involved in student activities, but it wasn't something that threatened the state itself. During that time, of course, we often met socially with Rita. We got to know the boys. And of course, there were others. There was his family, his youngest brother, John, who was also very supportive, of course, and proud of his brother. And a close friend of his, who was a friend of mine as well, was Kostas, who joined the movement that I had joined, the Congress of Democrats. Congress of Democrats was a small white organization that was part of the Congress Alliance, part of the ANC. So Costa joined COD, but eventually was arrested and sent to prison for a year for ignoring the banning of his activities, because he had been very active. By the way, he too was a medical doctor. While he was in prison, Costa met Dimitri Tsafendas, the man who killed apartheid, the man who actually assassinated Dr. Verwoerd, the architect and prime minister of apartheid. So George was involved in key trials throughout. There were hard times, actually, hectic. I myself turned to writing history and wrote a series that I felt were history from the perspective of people on the ground. After the release, though, of Mandela and the liberation, George was regularly featured in the many news items of Madiba. He had, of course, become very close to him, often went to Robben Island to discuss things whenever they could get permission, the lawyers, discuss issues with the prisoners on Robben Island. So there were many other reunions and celebrations afterwards, and under the new democracy. And George and I sort of felt Costa had left the country, and we were kind of the two Hellenes, Afro-Hellenes who were still around. And whenever there was an event like a funeral, and there were funerals as the old comrades began to leave us, or some event, social event, George would pick me up and we would drive to Krugersdorp, to Benoni. These are places, to the west and east of Johannesburg. And we would go together, and it was a kind of a statement, here are greetings, from democratic Greeks. And of course, democracy, we were very proud of, was in fact a Greek concept and a Greek word, which is now, held up as the way to express participation and humanity. Ubuntu, as it's called in South Africa, and anthropia in Greece. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for another wonderful story from the inside, or reflection from the inside on George Bizos. We're keeping wonderfully to time. Our next speaker, Professor John Dugard, has been with us from the beginning of this symposium. John Dugard is Professor Emeritus of International Law at the Universities of Leiden and Witwatersrand, which I realise I'm mispronouncing, I apologise. From 1978 to 1990, he was director of the University of Witwatersrand's Centre for Applied Legal Studies, which was committed to the promotion of human rights in South Africa. And from 1999 to 1997, director of the Lauterpacht Centre for International Law at the University of Cambridge. He has served on the International Law Commission, on the International Court of Justice, and is former Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. Professor Dugard has written books on apartheid, human rights and international law, including the very influential Human Rights in the South African Legal Order, published in 1978, and been very active in reporting on human rights violations and racism in apartheid South Africa, and more recently by Israel and the Palestinian territories. His most recent book, published in 2018, is Confronting Apartheid, A Personal History of South Africa, Namibia and Palestine. Professor Dugard will talk about his experiences in working with George Bizos on various trials and various cases, including the so-called Namibian Rivonia trial, and his own trial in 1978, when he was charged with a minor offence under the Internal Security Act and defended by George Bizos. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Jennifer. I presume that the sound system is working. Yes.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Well, let me begin by thanking you for inviting me to participate in today's session. It's very good to be with friends again, particularly Dikagang and Luli, who I may only see you virtually, but we have such a good past together that it's good to recall that past. I'd like to begin by speaking about being a human rights lawyer, if one can use that term, in South Africa during the apartheid era. One must bear in mind that there were very few lawyers who were committed to using the process of the law to promote human rights in South Africa. And inevitably, we tended to socialize with other lawyers and people on the left. And in this respect, I remember very well attending so many social gatherings with Luli. Those were the days in which the left tended to socialize quite exclusively. So that there were these social groups, and the lawyers also worked through bodies such as the Legal Resources Centre, Centre for Applied Legal Studies, Black Lawyers Association, Lawyers for Human Rights. George was intimately involved in all these bodies, and so we used to interact socially, and in that way I came to know George very well. We were good friends, and what made things even better was that George and I lived in neighboring suburbs, and so it was very easy for me to drop by and discuss matters with George and Rita. And of course, there were the wonderful occasions when George would invite the Johannesburg left to his lamb spit braais, and on a warm, sunny afternoon, we would watch George working very hard as a chef to produce a wonderful lamb on the spit, and then he would take us for little trips around his herb garden to show us his herbs, because George was a devoted gardener as well. I'm going to speak today not about the Rivonia trial, but about what has been described as the Namibia Rivonia trial, which in many respects was more important than the South African Rivonia trial, in the sense that it had greater international political implications. It ultimately led to the liberation of Namibia, and in this way contributed substantially to the liberation of South Africa itself. So let me just tell you a little bit about this trial and George's role in the trial. In 1966, the International Court of Justice gave a disastrous decision in which it refused to examine Ethiopia and Liberia's complaint that South Africa was applying apartheid in the mandated territory of Southwest Africa, now Namibia. And SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization, had been hoping that this decision would result in South Africa being compelled to leave the mandated territory and that they would achieve their goal of liberation. But of course, this didn't happen. And so the result is that Namibians, members of SWAPO, who had bases in Angola, in despair, really crossed the border into Southwest Africa, as it then was, and were duly arrested and duly tortured by the South African authorities. And at the same time, the South African authorities arrested the internal leaders of SWAPO, who had been organizing quite legitimately in Windhoek. In order to deal with the Namibians that they had arrested, the South African government passed its most notorious statute, the Terrorism Act of 1967, which was an extraordinary law in the sense that it was made retrospective to 1962. It provided for the death penalty. It authorized a form of solitary confinement, which resulted in torture for many decades. And it shifted the burden of proof onto the accused. So it was really a piece of legislation that was passed in order to deal with the SWAPO leadership. And the SWAPO leadership was then brought to trial in Pretoria in the old synagogue. There were 37 members of the SWAPO leadership who were put on trial. I was part of the team of lawyers that represented the SWAPO leadership. The leading counsel was Naomi Phillips, George Bizos, Ernie Wenzel, and Dennis Cooney, and myself were the other members of the team. And for me, this was a very important learning experience when it came to knowing more about George, because I'd heard much about George as a human rights lawyer, and I knew that he had played a significant role in the Rivonia trial, but I had really yet to experience George's true virtues as a lawyer. And I came away from that trial with a knowledge of George as a master in the art of the political trial, and also as someone who was able to develop a very special relationship with his clients. Of course, as a lawyer, George was good on the law and good on the facts, but I think that what distinguished George from other human rights lawyers in South Africa of that time was his ability to understand the nature of the political trial and to cope with the government's strategy. And also, as I've said, there was George's way of dealing with his clients. Let me say something about the political trial. Many lawyers, perhaps most lawyers, will say that there is no such thing as a political trial. They will say there's a civil trial and there's a criminal trial, but there's no such thing as a political trial. But of course, this is very naive. Governments frequently use the legal process in order to eliminate a political opponent, to discredit the cause that that opponent serves, to raise a state of fear amongst the population, and then to encourage the population to believe that they are coping with the situation, and that this is demonstrated by the fact that they brought these traitors to trial to dispose of them. And so the political trial really serves a useful purpose as far as any authoritarian regime is concerned. So in that situation, it's very important that the defense also has a strategy of its own kind in order to cope with the political trial. And this is where I say George was a master, because in this particular case, George contributed substantially by persuading Naomi Phillips, who was a rather old-fashioned traditionalist lawyer, to embark upon a very innovative strategy, and that was to challenge South Africa's administration over Southwest Africa, Namibia. In 1966, the General Assembly of the United Nations had adopted a resolution number 2145, in which it sought to revoke the mandate for Southwest Africa. And so in order to challenge South Africa's administration, we argued that the Terrorism Act was invalid because it had been passed after the revoking of the mandate, and South Africa was not entitled to be in the territory at all. This was not only innovative, it was also a a real challenge to the whole state of South Africa as it operated in Southwest Africa. And Phillips was very reluctant to argue this case, but it was almost entirely due to George's intervention that Phillips agreed to argue this case, which he did. So that was the first step that George took to internationalizing the whole trial. He also set about trying to present SWAPO in a more respectable way in order to portray it as a proper liberation movement. So the result of George's interventions of this kind was to really change the whole nature of the trial. In other words, the government's strategy backfired completely. The government had set out to use this as a show trial to eliminate the leadership of Southwest Africa, but in fact, it resulted in the exact opposite, that because there was now a challenge to the whole authority of South Africa in Southwest Africa, diplomats and foreign observers flocked to the trial, and the trial received tremendous international attention. It was brought to the attention of the General Assembly, but more important, it came before the Security Council of the United Nations. And this was the first occasion on which the Southwest African issue had been brought before the Security Council. And the Security Council ultimately, as a result of this, requested the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on South Africa's presence in Namibia. And in 1971, the court ruled that South Africa was illegally in Southwest Africa. It took some 20 years for this decision to result in the independence of Namibia, but it did serve as the guideline for the United Nations. So I think it's clear to say that the Namibian trial was the spark that led to the whole international movement against Southwest Africa and Namibia through the Security Council. And in large measure, George was responsible for that. The other thing that I remember about George was the way in which he handled clients. I think many lawyers tend to see clients as clients, as people to whom they are required to give legal advice. They don't relate to them very intimately and closely. George had a great warmth, and he was able to display that warmth in dealing with his clients. And in addition, he was able to convey to his clients that he endorsed the cause which they stood for, and that he shared their beliefs. And so that after some time with George, people began to realize that he was on their side, so to speak. And this was particularly important in this case because the SWAPO leadership had been brutally tortured. And when they arrived in Pretoria, they were very dispirited as a result of the way in which they had been treated. This is particularly true of the leading figure in that trial, Toivo Hermanyo Toivo, who later became a cabinet minister in the independent Namibia. He had been completely destroyed by torture, but George and others, but particularly George, succeeded in building up his spirits. And at the end of the trial, he delivered a wonderful speech, wonderful statement, which really was very similar to that made by Nelson Mandela in the Evangelia trial. And I know that George did help him in drafting that speech. I may say on the subject of encouraging clients, I have my own personal experience. I don't want to refer to my own trial, which was a very trivial affair. I was prosecuted for reading the speech of a banned person, person banned under the Internal Security Act. I'd made a mistake. I'd misread the banning order, and I was prosecuted, indicted, and the Minister of Justice said to the university, we don't want to embarrass one of your professors. As long as he apologizes, we will withdraw the charge. And I knew that if I did apologize, that would be the end of my career as opposition to the apartheid regime. And I discussed the matter with George, and I said to George, I really can't apologize. And George supported me completely, and I refused to apologize. And I was ultimately defended by both George and Sydney Kentridge, and cautioned and reminded. But it did give me a personal experience of how George was able to relate to his clients. And I think George was very special in that case. George appeared in many political trials. One thinks of the Rivonia trial, the Delmas trial, the inquest, the Agate inquest, and numerous other trials. But in all these cases, George was able to change the nature of the trial from a political trial designed to serve the interests of the apartheid regime to a political trial that served the interests of the opposition. So George really did succeed in undermining the whole strategy of the government in respect of the political trial. And I think that is one of the reasons why George was so much hated by the apartheid regime. Let me just conclude on one note, which something about George that I will always remember is that during the dark days of apartheid, foreign visitors would often ask George the question, George, what will you do after liberation? What post do you want to hold? And I heard this conversation quite often. George would say rather ponderously, I will not accept any office in a new regime because I will always take the view that there will be people in such a regime who will need my services, that there will be those who will be subjected to injustices and I will be needed by them. So I will not take office. And George carried out this promise. I'm quite sure that his friend Nelson Mandela must have offered him some reward. George was perhaps too old to take judicial appointment when the political change came, but I'm sure he must have been offered an ambassadorship, perhaps the ambassadorship in Greece, I don't know. But George steadfastly remained an advocate, and after the political transition, George continued to defend people through the Legal Resources Centre and at Morikanen and other spheres. And I think this indicates the devotion of George to the cause of justice and to the cause of the underdog. He was a very, very special person, and I'll be honoured and privileged to have worked with him and to regard him as a friend. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's very interesting to hear more about his talents and skills as a lawyer. Thank you. Before we move on to the discussion, I wonder if, I see we have Julian Burnside with us. Julian is a patron of Agora Dialogue. Julian, could I invite you to join us? Would you like to join us? Turn your microphone on and at least be able to participate in the discussion following the panel presentations? So are you happy to do that?
That will go to, because I've got other commitments.
Okay.
So what sort of time were you thinking?
Well, I'm going to introduce briefly each of the people who are contributing to the panel, and then we'll have a broader discussion with both the speakers and the panel members, to which you would be very welcome to contribute if you can stay with us that long.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Right, so we have 40 minutes for the next part of the symposium. I will briefly introduce each of the 5 members of the panel, and they will each speak briefly, and then we will open it up to a broader discussion, both with the speakers and the members of the panel. So the first person I would like to call on is Alexis Bizos, who is now, yes, back with us. Alexis, you will need to turn your microphone on, I think. Looks like it's off. Alexis is, of course, the son of George Bizos. He's a mechanical engineer and consultant, owner of his own business, Greencraft Lighting, which is a lighting manufacturing business in Johannesburg. Would you like to say a few words, please, Alexis?
Thank you. Am I heard? Is sound fine?
Yes, yes.
Just to explain, I'm the youngest of 3 sons. My eldest brother, Kimon, is in the UK. My brother, Damon, is here in Johannesburg, both doctors. In some way, I got involved here because I know George quite well from chaperoning my father to Australia in 2010, where we did a whirlwind trip of Perth, Melbourne, Sydney, back to Perth. Won't go into the details except to say that I remember the day that we were in Sydney, and my father addressed the 200 members of the bar in Sydney. In the morning, we flew across Australia, and he addressed 100 members of the Perth bar in the evening. And notwithstanding the year before, he had had a serious operation on his brain where he had some leaking of blood into his brain. He still had a lot of energy, and we just, as his sons and spouses and children, have had to run after my father for many years. To say that he worked up until, he would go to the office until 2018, August 2018, at which point we persuaded him that he could carry on doing some work at home, and he would have members of the LRC and other people coming to him. And there would be, I think his last concerns in his professional life was really to see justice for the victims of apartheid, and to make sure that, try and make sure that some prosecutions got going, and for the promise of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission suggested that there need to be, I think, a number of 300 or 400, I'm not sure, I think it was 300 people needed to be prosecuted. Not many have been prosecuted. And he was involved pretty much to the end with the Timol reopening of the Timol inquest, in which he, the no one to blame verdict was overturned, and there's currently an attempt to prosecute an octogenarian who was involved. So, I think there's a lot to say, and I don't want to, how much time do I have? Because, I don't want to others need to speak. But I just thought I've made some notes in picking up on some of the speakers, and some anecdotes. And I also understand that possibly you would want to know more personal details that not necessarily in the public domain. So I wasn't given an indication. I thought that we'd just have a discussion.
Yes.
There's a few minutes where I could just kind of give some anecdotes and responses to some of the speakers. Would that be in order?
Yes, I think that would be fine. Thank you.
Well, let's get down to the culinary part, and that is the lamb on the spit part, which has been mentioned. And my late uncle Stavros, just to introduce the family, my father was one of 4 siblings, he being the firstborn, my aunt Vaso the secondborn, then Stavros, then John. And years ago, at one of these occasions, I think that were mentioned by John, someone said, "George, what a wonderful lamb on the spit you've roasted." And my uncle Stavros, who looked actually very much like my father and sometimes was confused in public as to being my father, said, "Don't be silly." He says, all George does is say, "Rita, please order the lamb," and Alexis would make it. And to my benefit, our benefit, we all learned how to make lambs on the spit, but I learned the skill from 11 years old, and my father never really did anything since I was 11 years old. Just to say that my late uncle Stavros, who was very supportive of my father, unfortunately died in 1994 at age 60 years old. Had a heart condition that he didn't know about and had a heart attack and died. And he was very supportive of my father. And there was a period in the late 60s where a lot of people had gone to prison, including Bram Fischer and others. And my father got a message from the Prime Minister Foster saying, "Sê vir hom dat sy tou word kort," which means tell him that his rope is becoming short. My uncle Stavros had started a catering equipment business, and my father had helped him together with Henry Panos, who was the financier. My father would help and advise, and had a share in a small share in the business. And my uncle Stavros, my father didn't want to confide. I mean, a lot of these things have come out, and it's too brief now to explain. But the family was under attack. There were stories about an apartheid agent that courted my mother's sister with a specific purpose of trying to marry into the family. But was caught out when my father saw him at the Rivonia trial with Bram Fischer in a motor vehicle with one of the generals of the security. But he said he revealed this to me. He says, didn't have the heart to say anything. And this was in 2017 when my aunt died, and I was driving into the cemetery that he revealed this. So anyway, my father didn't want to scare my mother, and confided in his brother Stavros, and his brother said, "Look, if the landlord has to wait for the rental in the business, then so be it. But I'll make sure that your wife and children are covered." So there was Stavros, and then my aunt Vaso, who died less than 24 hours after my father in the village in Greece. At 90 years old. My uncle John, who Luli mentioned, died earlier this year at the beginning of August. So that generation is gone. We overwhelmed as a family in the outpouring of love and attention to detail. And it's been wonderful. There's just so much online and people speaking and condolences. And my brothers and I are still receiving emails of stories of my father, most of which we know, but interesting personal relationships. And there's a lot. As I said, there's a lot to talk about. And I don't want to hog the floor, and maybe I can come in later with other anecdotes.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you very much. We'll move on to I just introduced the second speaker or member of the panel, Professor Kostas Gouliamos, who is the Rector and Professor of Politics, Culture and Communication at the European University of Cyprus in Nicosia. He's written widely on organizational practices, corporate social responsibility, social media and political marketing, and political and cultural communication, and is very active in promoting research in the humanities and social sciences in Cyprus. Kostas, if you would like to say a few words before we move on to introduce the rest of the panel and have our discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate the invitation to participate in this discussion. I would like to say that experiencing extreme levels of inequality caused by the social class system, and in particular social discrimination in South Africa, Mandela's and Bizos' political action derived from, both from Thomas Aquinas' philosophy for the betterment of humanity and from the socialist principle of equality for all human beings, has significantly contributed worldwide to a culture of social justice. Their political action centered around and within the principle of social justice as an apparatus for human rights, especially to groups and classes which historically marginalized based on their race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, and religion. Today, as we pray to Mandela and particularly to Bizos' social and political struggle, it is of paramount importance to extend our thought to social conditions. In this view, allow me to elaborate on this argumentation. To be more specific, dear colleagues, dear friends, it is about time to open a world dialogue on the way and mechanisms that dominant countries employ with the aim to redesign and or reform neo-colonial politics, such as a Webb arbitrary legal and political control emerged by hyper-national entities like IMF, World Bank, and so on and so on. The most fundamental social conditions should be or must be examined. I'm sorry. And the relationships also between classes with themselves arise depending on how society organizes production. Different ways of organizing production give us, you know, quite well, give rise to different classes. History has known a number of different forms of class society, but the common future is a minority ruling class who exploits the working majority by expropriating or even stealing the surplus wealth created by the labor. This is a fundamental division of society. On the other hand, racial and ethnic discrimination occurred on a daily basis, not just in South Africa, but everywhere around the world for centuries, due to the colonial politics and the imperialist antagonistic or competitive system. That's why I ask, you know, for a dialogue, an open dialogue worldwide about the new system that comes up. Besides, I would say that the white Europeans moved onto the continents of Asia and Africa. They had become by the large colonialists who were interested in building an imperial system for their mother country. Accordingly, they constructed only the kind of racially segmented plural society as this was existed in their own, I would say, countries. More particular, the English created a society in South Africa and in every country around the world, a society whose institutions were molded in their racial religious and national image. They took particular pride in the structure of their governance that they built in many, I would say, colonies around the world, including South Africa. As colonists, the English as well as the Dutch subjected the non-whites with whom they came into contact to force and fraud. And they subjected, killed, or drove them off. People, the subordinated people were overwhelmed by force of arms, deprived of their land and resources, and treated as a conquered subject or inhuman enemy. Whatever I would like to think and say about this, the most important fact is that we have to take into account the disasters of the two world wars in the 20th century, which expressed themselves in racist and nationalistic ideologies, as we described, as we know them. And the so-called, in quotation marks, of course, official policy of the imperialist capitalist classes whose predecessors created racism as a hypocritical anti-racism. But racism and racial inequality in the 21st century is something that should be examined, analyzed, as I said previously. We have to find the material roots in capitalism's very nature as a system of a class inequality. Racial systemic inequality is one of its forms of appearance. As long as society, yes, I will finish. As long as society remains divided into classes, the social conditions for racism will remain. So this is the struggle that Mandela and Bizos gave, and as protagonists of a social movement, I would like to follow their, I would say, social and political paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kostas. Moving on, the next member of the panel is Dr. Klearchos Kyriakides. Kyriakos is Deputy Head of the School of Law and Assistant Professor in English Law, Constitutional History and Professional Skills at the University of Central Lancashire in Cyprus. His research interests include democracy and the rule of law, international humanitarian law, and interestingly, the themes of justice and injustice as portrayed in the lyrics of Greek music, which I would like to hear more about when we next meet Klearchos. If you, I really would like to have us to have as much time as possible for discussion. So if you could try and be brief, please, Klearchos.
Thank you very much, Dr. Webb, for chairing, and thank you to all of the speakers. I've learned a great deal through participating today. I never had the privilege of meeting Mr. Bizos, but I ought to extend my condolences to his family, and I ought to acknowledge the fact that he did inspire me from afar. And I will just say 2 or 3 things in 2 or 3 minutes and leave the floor then for others. I mean, I was born as a member of the Greek and Cypriot diaspora in the United Kingdom, and I ended up studying law, practicing law for a number of years, and I now teach law. And lawyers such as George Bizos inspired me because they taught me what it means to be a true lawyer. And a true lawyer, as I see it, as I was taught, and as I now teach my students, is somebody who adheres to certain fundamental principles and values. And we've heard some of those principles and values identified by some of the other speakers. As they were speaking, I was just jotting down some notes. So let me just read to you one paragraph which encapsulates my thoughts. And I'm very conscious as I issue these remarks that this event is not only important for us now, it will hopefully be an educational resource that can be used for the benefit of law students in the future. So I'm directing these remarks partly to the attendees, but also to any law students who observe this video, this event at a later date. My point is as follows. The career of the late Mr. Bizos teaches us something truly fundamental, and it's encapsulated in the observation of Justice Moseneke. Mr. Bizos was committed to the powerless, the tormented, and the oppressed. And some lawyers, for perfectly understandable reasons, end up advising the powerful. But some lawyers end up advising the powerless. And put simply, circumstances may require a lawyer to decide whether he or she wishes to stand up against or to stand up for an authoritarian or otherwise undemocratic regime. That's another lesson of history that flows from the career of Mr. Bizos, and I would suggest the career of Justice Moseneke and others who participated in the campaign, the legal campaign against apartheid. So I'm going to now come to a question that I'd like to put to Justice Moseneke, Professor Dugard, Mr. Ieridou, and any other lawyers who are participating in the audience. And the question is this: what should and this is a question I would suggest that is of crucial importance in the Eastern Mediterranean, where I am at the moment, where some lawyers in some parts of the Eastern Mediterranean are facing oppression and victimization and bullying and other forms of unfair conduct purely because they are representing clients who are treated by the state as undesirables or worse. And the question is this: what should a lawyer do if suddenly or gradually confronted with the reality that he or she is practicing law in the face of systemic forms of inequality, inhumanity, impunity, and injustice? My simple answer to my question is that a lawyer must exercise moral courage. That is easier said than done. And that's why I would welcome the thoughts of Justice Moseneke, Professor Dugard, perhaps Mr. Burnside and Mr. Ieridou in response. So what should a lawyer do if suddenly or gradually confronted with the reality that he or she is practicing law in the face of systemic forms of inequality, inhumanity, impunity, and injustice? Thank you.
Thank you, Klearchos. Let's keep that question on the table and come back to it after we've introduced our other panel speakers. Thank you very much for that. The next member of the panel is Koukkides-Procopiou, who is a senior fellow and member of the advisory board of the Cyprus Center for European and International Affairs at the University of Nicosia. She has been an expert participant in working groups run by the European Commission, European Parliament, the Council of Europe, and the Union for the Mediterranean, and is a regular public speaker, political analyst, and commentator on issues of foreign policy, inclusive security, and gender in both local and international media. Anna.
Thank you, Jennifer. When I was approached by the Agora Dialogue Forum to comment on this panel on George Bizos, immediately I thought, what can I possibly say about George Bizos that hasn't been said or will not be said by people who actually knew him? And then I started thinking not as the analyst or as the academic, but I started thinking as the historian, as the activist, and as the teacher that I am. And it occurred to me, we always discuss with our students in class, especially in international relations and history, the question of agency versus the structure. So who makes the difference? Is it the system? Is this, the impersonal forces of history and social change, which sweep people through the tides and bring about the change? Or is the change instituted, is it brought about by individuals like you and me, like George Bizos? And these are very tough times for Cyprus that I come from, where I live. And as an activist, I've been very disillusioned lately with lots of let's say, dark things happening in Cyprus on many levels. So when we've been discussing these kind of questions of morality, these questions of doing your own little thing and every little bit helps or doesn't help, I think a great example, a prime example of a role model is someone like George Bizos. And just allow me to comment on a few of the words. I mean, some phrases were mentioned which characterized George Bizos and his attitude towards activism, civil society, and using his professional skills for what he considered to be the common good. Now, the first question that comes to mind is, what makes someone like George Bizos stand out to injustice? It's the same question that my students always ask me when they see the video of the man with the 2 plastic bags in Tiananmen Square standing in front of the tanks and not letting the tanks go through. It's the same question that I was asked when the archaeologist in Palmyra would die and not reveal where all the treasures of Palmyra were. And it's the same question that I get asked when a very common story to the story we heard in the beginning about the Bizos family protecting the soldiers. We have a very similar story during the Turkish invasion in Cyprus with Kyriakides Lapidou, this old lady who protected 12 soldiers, and she wouldn't give them to the Turkish army, and she was tortured and still wouldn't talk. So I was thinking, you know, what made George Bizos a person who he was? And of course, being a historian and being a student of ancient history, I would say he's a Messenian. You know, the Messenians were the only people who actually stood up to the Spartans. They were always in constant fight with the Spartans who tried to enslave him. So he's a tough cookie, if you like, coming back from his descent from Messenia. But then something else occurred to me. You know, in Herodotus, the disgraced Spartan king Dimarados finds he finds himself in the Persian court, and he's asked by the Persian king, who is in disbelief that, you know, the very few Spartans would stand up to his army of thousands. And he says, you know, what kind of master will be there forcing the Spartans to fight? And Dimarados says, well, the master is the law, because the Spartans would carry the law inside them. There was no written constitution in Sparta. So the walls and the laws of Sparta were embedded in its people. So this is what I thought when I was thinking about George Bizos. George Bizos was a lawyer who carried the law within him. Not a lawyer and I think this would be my answer to Klearchos' question. What makes some lawyers stand out when there is hardship to be faced, like the one he has just pointed out? And I think the lawyers who carry the law within them is the people who actually make the difference in this very dark world that we're currently living in. And a word was used before. It was a duty and obligation. I think Georgiou said this. The family felt the duty and obligation. They never lost hope. Someone else said stamina and resilience. This migrant from a community which did not want to rock the society in which they lived, and yet he did. And there was one word that was said about Bizos, and I think it was Dr. Callinicos who said it, anthropia. So these values are not just Greek values, they're not Messenian values, they're not Spartan values, they're human values. And I think what makes George Bizos a role model for everyone in the world, for someone to look up to, a role model that we can use to teach our students a very useful lesson when we're talking about agency versus structure. I think George Bizos is the exemplary prototype of a man bringing change in the world, along, of course, with Nelson Mandela. So this is my 2 cents of wisdom. I'm happy to contribute to the discussion later on. So I will leave the floor for questions and more comments.
Thank you very much, Anna. I think the biggest question that we're all asking is, how do we create more George Bizoses for the future of the world? But hopefully we'll have time to come back to that. So if I could bring in finally Patrick Nkhoma. Patrick is, where's Patrick? There he is. Has degrees in aeronautical engineering, business administration and development economics, and has worked in the aviation industry, in the university sector, and as a consultant for small and medium businesses. For over 15 years, he was an Australian education consultant in Africa. And since 1998, through his company, the C&N Centre for Advanced International Studies, has set up and coordinated in-country training programs for public sector organizations in Zambia. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and greetings to all of you from Zambia. This is a very special day for us because this is our 56th Independence Day. Amazing that this occasion comes at this moment. So for us here, it's a joyous moment of celebrating our 56 years of freedom from our colonial masters. And the reflections that I have on the legend and the leader of the legal system in South Africa that helped us achieve our goal. And I just want to give you some perspectives. I was born in 1953, October. This year was my 67th birthday. That means I lived during the apartheid or colonial system of Zambia and South Africa. I touched and breathed these environments of unequal rights. So I'm coming with that type of understanding that our president, Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, who is amazingly still alive, inculcated in some of us that were there during the struggle and during the time of independence and up to now, inculcated in us the fact that we cannot be free until the whole Africa is free. And to do that, there was a mechanism that Dr. Kenneth Kaunda unleashed. They appointed what they called the frontline states. This was, Zambia was the leader of the frontline states, and countries from within the region that were independent became part of that frontline states. Now, what was the role of Zambia in the life of George Bizos, in the life of Nelson Mandela? Zambia was the headquarters of the ANC. Oliver Tambo, even the former president, also lived here. So we hosted the ANC head office here. And from the book that George Bizos wrote, there is a page and a reflection on one occasion where George Bizos was sent by Nelson Mandela from the prison to come and confer primarily with the ANC head office, and this was Oliver Tambo and the team. He couldn't come to Zambia just to see Oliver Tambo. In this occasion, he actually met, and I think Kenneth Kaunda hosted that meeting when George Bizos was sent to come and make strict and critical decisions that needed answers and support from the ANC head office. And I remember from the book that when George Bizos told Kenneth Kaunda that he had greetings from Nelson Mandela and this was the mission, our Kaunda is very well known even in many other occasions. When something hurts him or feels sympathy, he's a man who had emotions. And on this particular occasion, Kenneth Kaunda broke down and cried and sent the message, the emissary message back to Nelson that we are not going to leave you alone. We are in this together. I must also confirm to the panel that there were occasions when the regime was so vicious. Not only did it torture and kill people within South Africa, the regime actually, I remember at one stage, came to Zambia and bombed a number of ANC military bases. And these bases were hosted in places where Zambians were living. So a lot of Zambian blood was poured during the struggle for the ANC and the apartheid system. Now, my contribution to all this is the fact that freedom and independence comes at a price. And ultimately, there are people that have to pay more of the price than others. And these are the leaders, the visionaries, in the names of Nelson Mandela, and from the legal fraternity in the names of George Bizos. So I would like to contribute to the panel to mention that in life, it takes one person to change the world. And there are many examples. From the Bible is Jesus Christ, from the Islam is Muhammad, from the tyrannical activities, it's Osama bin Laden. And there are so many names that we can name, both good and evil. But this name of George Bizos is a name that changed the landscape of the apartheid system in South Africa. I thank you all.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm really sorry about this, but I think we have about 8 minutes for discussion because we do need to end on time, and I need a minute or two at the end to wrap things up. So can I please open it up to the several questions which have been posed by speakers on the panel, so we can make take as much advantage of this little time that we have, and then maybe we can ask Dinos to organize another symposium to continue our discussion. So would anyone like to contribute, come in and respond to some of the questions that have been posed?
May I very quickly say something about what both Dr. Kyriakides and Dr. Anna Koukkides, I hope my pronunciation is tolerable.
Yes, yes, please.
Said about the courage of conviction, about moral courage to stand up. Let's limit to a lawyer for a moment, and how they would deal with, for instance, the ever-present debate between agency, personal agency that is, and structure.
Yes.
And where do people draw then the courage? Let me start by saying, when I wrote my second book recently, I came to the conclusion that the average human being is pretty scared of standing up to power, and that many choose to roll over in the face of structured state power, where the power arrives just straight from politics, or it's class power, or whatever its origins might be. And because power always is coercive, very few people actually do garner the courage. And that is why we celebrate George Bizos, Nelson Mandela, and there are many other examples. I wrote a paper celebrating the Ruth Fest not so long ago. And I was talking about the courage of conviction. I don't think it comes easily, and that is why we're celebrating Uncle George. I don't think there are many human beings who are going to rise to that incredible level. Average lawyers who want to get it easygoing, but actually those who stand out are many. How do you garner this? I don't think anybody knows how. I think, I think it's learned. I think I can't say it's ever wired into somebody from birth. And we'll continue, I think, to respect and cherish those who stand up, but on an ethically correct platform. And I'm afraid there won't be many, I've learned. When I was a young revolutionary, I thought it was automatic. When I'm older, I know that it comes slowly. It doesn't come often. And we're back at a point in South Africa where I'm urging young people to rise. Don't accept the oppression in its new form, post-democratic, post-transition oppression and corruption and all of that stuff. It looks like perpetually we need human beings that are going to inspire us to go to scale even higher, obstructions. Thanks.
Thank
Jennifer,
you.
can I come in?
Yes, yes, Alexis.
Just to answer Anna Koukkides and to follow on from Dikagang, as to where it all comes from. And, our father was at Wits University, went to Wits University at University of Witwatersrand in 1948. And he got involved very quickly in student politics. And there was a protest and the National Party, which, the party of apartheid came into power to consolidate racial oppression and segregation. And they were really, from the beginning, gunning for the exclusion of black people from the university. And there was the chancellor, the vice chancellor, had assured somebody in parliament that don't worry, it's just a group, radical fringe, that really opposes the segregation. And it's just a bunch of leftists. And my father, pretty unknown, our father, pretty unknown, and a firebrand, got up and said, if I'm labeled a leftist because I stand up for my fellow students, then I'm proud to be one. That then, the next day in the leading Afrikaner conservative paper, there was a headline, linksgesind en trots daarop, left wing and proud of it. And that was the beginning. There was no turning back for my father, our father, and the rest is history.
Thank you.
Yes.
Does anyone else want to jump in? Yes.
Yes. Could I jump in and just reply to a question posed by Klearchos, and that is, what does an individual do or a lawyer do in an unjust system? What are the choices open to a lawyer? And I think there are two choices. Either one can join the revolution, so to speak, and try to overthrow the unjust system by illegal means, or one can use one's legal skills in order to oppose the unjust system. And I think George took a conscious decision to follow the latter course. He used his legal skills in order to oppose the system of apartheid. And it's highly arguable that his contribution in this respect was as great as many of those who resorted to other strategies.
Thank you. I'm afraid I am going to have to wind things up. I think we could go on for much longer, and I'm so sorry that we can't do that on this occasion, at least. I would like to thank very warmly all of our speakers for sharing their wisdom and their time with us tonight. I think it's been a wonderful occasion. I would also like again to thank Dinos Toumazos, Eva Ieridou, and Agora Dialogue for organising this occasion. I just, in closing, would like to say that much of this discussion reminds me of some of the things that Martin Luther King wrote about in his letter from Birmingham City Jail in Alabama, Birmingham in 1963, where he refers to his disappointment with the white moderate who is more devoted to order than justice, and to the do-nothingism of the complacent, and even more powerfully, to the appalling silence of the good people. I think much of what we're talking about is how we make the good people actually do something. That it's not good enough just to know what is the right thing to do, but unless you actually follow that with action, it doesn't mean very much at all. And also, just to close with another quote from Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham City Jail, which I think refers directly to the kind of rare and remarkable contribution to humanity that George Bizos has made, where Martin Luther King says, "Few members of the oppressor race can understand the deep groans and passionate yearnings of the oppressed race, and still fewer have the vision to see that injustice must be rooted out by strong, persistent, and determined action." So thank you again very much to everyone for a wonderful, well, evening for me, day for you and the rest of the world. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dinos and Eva.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Until next time.
Until next time, indeed. Thank you, Luli.